Hello, and welcome to another 9-minute Bible study. Our starting point, 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Let's start with verse 11. My sons, be not now negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him, to serve him, that you should minister to him and burn incense. In the verses prior to this one, King Hezekiah had called the priests and the Levites back to service. His father, King Ahaz, he rejected the Lord his God. He closed the temple and did not allow the priests and the Levites to fulfill their roles as God had called them. Now King Hezekiah, he is calling them back to active service. We saw earlier in verse 5 that they were to sanctify themselves, sanctify the house of the Lord, and carry forth the filthiness out of the holy place. Now, let's look at sanctify yourself, since that's what's really going to begin in verse 12. The children of Israel, we can divide them into three classes when it comes to religion. It begins with one, the congregation. That is everybody in Israel. All 12 tribes, including the Levites. Congregation. Now, the Lord separated the Levites from the rest of the tribes to perform religious duty all the time in the tabernacle, the temple, throughout the land of Canaan. So, the Levites, they were called out from the congregation to perform duties for the Lord. When they were set apart from the other tribes in order to perform the work of the Lord. That does not mean the congregation was bad, but the congregation, they are not the Levites. They are not the ones called to perform the religious duty. The Levites were. They were separated from the rest of the nation for religious service. Inside the Levites, you had the descendants of Aaron, the priest. They were separated from the Levites in order to perform priestly duties, to minister to the Lord and the people in the tabernacle, later the temple. Now, if you look at this from a New Testament point of view, everyone in the church is congregation. When we gather together, we are all congregation. However, the Lord called out certain people to perform certain duties in the church. We read about helpers, those who sing and worship the Lord, those who are ushers, those who work in the media department, those who work in the business department, those who perform the maintenance duties of the church. They have been set aside for the Lord for their call. They are separated from the congregation to do this. The ministers, the fivefold ministry, they have been separated not just from the congregation, but they've really been separated even from the helpers in order to perform their duties to the Lord. The helpers are there to help the ministers. The ministers are there to minister to the Lord and the congregation. But first, they have to separate themselves from the rest of the congregation to perform those duties. That's what we see in the church. And Jesus called ministers separating themselves so they could minister to the Lord. Now, in 2 Chronicles 29, verse 12, the Levites arose, and then in verse 15, not reading the list of names, they gathered their brethren and set themselves or sanctified themselves and came according to the commandment of the king by the word of the Lord to cleanse the house of the Lord. So what did they do? They separated themselves from the rest of the congregation. There's nothing wrong with being congregation unless you have been called to be something else. The Levites, they were called to be the helpers in the house of the Lord. They answered their call. They separated themselves from the people and they answered that call. The priest, what did they do? The exact same thing. They separated themselves from the congregation and the helpers to answer their call. First, separation. Then what do we see? The end of verse 15. Cleanse the house of the Lord. The Levites, because of the nature of the tabernacle, they were not allowed into the actual holy place building. They were not allowed into the holies of holies or the holy place in front of it. The priest had to clean that out. It was the job of the priest to minister and to clean the inside. What was the three things in the inside? It was the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the candlestick. They had to make sure all of these were ready for service, and it began by cleaning the filth out of the place. Now, the Levites, they were on the outside. They handled things on the outside. They had to cleanse the altar of sacrifice. They had to get the laver back ready for use. Everyone had a job, and they did this according to pattern, according to the way that the Lord had called them. Now, according to verse 16, the priest went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it, and brought out all the uncleanness that they found in the temple of the Lord into the court of the house of the Lord, and the Levites took it to carry it abroad into the brook Kidron. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing the priests take care of things internal and the Levites things external in the church age. What do the ministers deal with? They deal with what? Things spiritual. What did Peter say when he was talking to the church in Acts 8? He said what? We have been called prayer and study. We have been called to the inside ministry that deals with the spirit of a person. Now, what are the modern helpers in the church dealing with? Things external, as in music, as in being ushers, as in media and business office and things like that. But when it comes to the deeper spiritual issues, who has been called to deal with that? The priest in the old, the ministers in the new. They have been set apart to deal with things spiritual. And we need to allow the fivefold ministry to do their job, and the Levites, or what we now call the helpers, to do their part, things on the outside. We'll pick up with this in our next lesson.